There's something almost invisible that silently guides many of our daily choices. The need to control time, outcomes, people's reactions, and the direction of life itself. Even without realizing it, we build routines, plans, and strategies not just to reach goals, but to avoid the unexpected. We live as if we're supposed to avoid all discomfort, all detours, all changes outside of our expectations. But does that really protect us or just trap us? Modern society convinced us that control equals safety. Having everything under control seems like the ultimate achievement. But if you pay attention, there's a clear and uncomfortable paradox. The more we try to control, the more anxious and insecure we become. It's as if chasing the feeling of complete safety makes us even more afraid of losing it. Have you ever caught yourself trying to predict every detail of a situation, thinking that would guarantee nothing would go wrong? Have you felt anxious after realizing that even with all your effort, some things are simply out of your hands? That feeling is more common than it seems, and it reveals something deep about how we relate to reality. We're trying to control what, by nature, can't be controlled. This obsession with control doesn't come just from wanting to organize life, but from discomfort, the fear of the unknown, the fear of not knowing what will happen, of being surprised, of losing control over what's happening. But what most people don't see is that when we try to control everything, we lose emotional freedom. We start to depend on things being just right in order to feel peace. That's the trap. This constant effort to manage the outside world might look like strength, but it often hides a huge inner fragility. The more we try to align everything around us, the more we disconnect from reality as it is, unpredictable, always changing, full of things that don't follow the logic of absolute control. What makes it even more complex is that this desire is always being fed. We live in a culture that treats control as a virtue. Control your emotions, your results, other people, the future. But the truth is that this exaggerated value placed on control builds an impossible expectation and an unavoidable frustration. Maybe it's time to question the logic behind it. Why do we believe that controlling everything is a sign of strength? And why do we ignore the fact that most of what affects us is not, and never was, under our command? Few people notice that the act of trying to control is already a sign of imbalance, and the more we invest in that effort, the further we get from the stability we're chasing. Because maybe true strength isn't in keeping everything under control, but in knowing what to do when control is no longer an option. Behind this need for control, there's often not a real need for order, but a desire to avoid something even more uncomfortable, the feeling of vulnerability. In a world where unpredictability is the norm, we hold on to the idea that if we can just control everything around us, we'll be protected from pain, loss, or failure. But that's where the mistake begins. Control, in this context, isn't a tool for balance. It's a disguise. It shows up as protection, but it comes from something shaky, insecurity. It's common to confuse control with responsibility. At first glance, organizing life, planning ahead, anticipating problems looks like a way to take care, to be cautious, to be efficient. But what's often hidden behind this behavior is fear of feeling powerless. It's the discomfort of not having quick answers, the unease of not knowing what to do when life stops following the script we made. When we feel insecure in life, we try to compensate by controlling whatever is within reach, even if it's just on the surface. We create the illusion that if we can control every external detail, we'll be able to calm what's out of balance inside. But that illusion is fragile. It gives us a short sense of stability while making us emotionally dependent on everything going as planned. Even the smallest change starts to feel like a threat. This is when efficiency shows up as a shield. The desire to be productive, organized, proactive, all things that society rewards, can turn into an unconscious defense mechanism. The more insecure we feel, the more we try to show control through efficiency. Life turns into a project to optimize. But in this case, efficiency doesn't mean balance. It's a more refined way of hiding the fear of not knowing how to deal with the unexpected. It's easy to mix up these two impulses, the urge to control and the urge to protect. They seem similar. Both are trying to avoid suffering, but the difference is in where they come from. Healthy protection comes from awareness and flexibility. Excessive control comes from rigidity and anxiety. One is moved by wisdom, the other by fear. And when fear starts driving our decisions, we end up distorting reality. We see threats where there are none. We react to possibilities, not facts. And we waste energy trying to prevent situations that may never even happen. But this kind of behavior has a cost. We lose our sense of ease. Everything turns into a field of constant monitoring. We stop living the present freely and start watching it like we're always waiting for the next mistake, the next detour, the next sign that things are out of hand. And once again, the more we try to stay in control, the more we move away from the peace we were looking for in the first place. The trap is subtle, because the need to control shows up as care. Insecurity shows up as competence. And little by little, without realizing it, we start measuring our well-being by how much we can keep under control. But real stability doesn't come from what we manage to control. It comes from how we relate to what we can't control. And this is the point where many people begin to feel emotionally drained, even when everything looks fine on the outside. Because control, no matter how effective it may seem, never guaranteed balance. It only hides a deeper instability still running behind the scenes, always waiting for an opening. Much of the frustration we go through in life doesn't come from the events themselves, but from our insistence on trying to control what was never ours to control. There's a big difference between what we can influence and what we can actually control, but that line is constantly blurred. And it's exactly this confusion that feeds anxiety, tension, and disappointment. Trying to control what's outside of us is like trying to hold water in your hands. No matter how much strength or skill you use, it always slips through your fingers. The truth is that the outer world moves with forces we can't always understand, much less control. Circumstances change, people change, time moves on, and none of these things follow our will. But that doesn't mean we're completely at the mercy of chaos. There is one place where control is real, and it's the place most people overlook: our own mind, our thoughts, our interpretations, our reactions and decisions. The way we choose to see a situation, the meaning we give to it, the way we choose to respond when faced with a challenge or frustration, all of that is within our direct responsibility. Have you ever tried to control someone's behavior, hoping they would act the way you expected? And when that didn't happen, how did you feel? Angry, frustrated, disappointed? The problem wasn't them. It was the expectation of control. While we try to shape the outer world to match our desires, we ignore the one thing that is truly within our reach: how we position ourselves internally. There is a real kind of freedom that comes when we understand this difference. That powerless feeling many people experience comes from constantly trying to change the unchangeable, to interfere where there's no space, to hold on to what is, by nature, unstable. But when we bring our attention inward to what we can actually manage, our thoughts, our posture, our awareness, the weight of resistance begins to fade. Still, it's common to confuse influence with control. People think that because they can spark a reaction or impact something or someone, they have power over the outcome. But influence is not certainty. We can inspire, guide, and encourage, but in many cases, the result is still out of our hands. And without this clarity, Any deviation from what we hoped for feels like failure. That feeds unnecessary cycles of guilt and pressure. This difference between what's internal and what's external has to be remembered over and over again. Not because it's hard to grasp, but because it's easy to forget. In the noise of the world, the flood of expectations, demands, and pressure, we're led to believe we must handle it all, as if life's balance depends solely on our ability to manage everything around us. But the real turning point comes when we start taking control of what actually belongs to us, our perception, our presence, our inner attitude. That's where a quiet but powerful shift begins, a shift that doesn't require reality to change first, just a shift in how we're looking at it. There's a type of exhaustion that doesn't come from the body, but from the mind. It's the tiredness of constantly trying to anticipate everything. Every scenario, every reaction, every outcome, as if peace could only come after we've predicted every detail of the path ahead. This constant alertness, which may look like preparation, is actually a symptom of anxiety, of someone who still believes the world should always be under control. Have you ever felt like if you're not watching everything closely, something will definitely go wrong? Like you need to predict every possible outcome just to avoid being caught off guard? That feeling is more common than you think. It comes from the desire to control variables that were never really ours to begin with. And it's this endless effort to predict life that leads to one of the most exhausting emotional states we can experience, the cycle of frustration. The more we try to control what happens around us, the more expectations we create. We expect people to act how we imagined. We expect our plans to unfold exactly as we designed. We expect our days to follow the mental script we created. But reality doesn't obey our projections. The world isn't here to follow our rules. And when things fall out of line, as they always do, we feel like we failed. Not because something actually went wrong, but because reality didn't match what we wanted it to be. This kind of frustration is sneaky because it feels reasonable. It's not wrong to want things to go well. But when that desire becomes rigid, when we can only feel peace if everything happens exactly as planned, we start living on the edge of emotional collapse. One small change becomes a huge problem. One unexpected turn becomes a threat. What starts as a simple wish for order slowly turns into an obsessive need for control, not just over circumstances, but over people, over life, over everything. We try to force coherence onto a world that was never meant to be controlled, and that always leads to anxiety, because trying to dominate the outside world keeps us trapped in a state of constant tension. The body might be still, but the mind never rests. It's always evaluating, predicting, projecting. At any moment, something could go wrong, and we feel the need to be ready. But that constant readiness isn't wisdom. It's fear, disguised as responsibility. And that fear, even when silent, eats away at us from the inside. Frustration doesn't come from what actually happens. It comes from the gap between what happens and what we expected to happen. That distance between the real world and the imagined one is where dissatisfaction starts to build. And the more we try to shape reality to fit our mental models, the further we move from accepting what really is. Not because acceptance is the same as giving up, but because constant resistance creates deep emotional exhaustion. This illusion that we can, and should, control the outside world leads to a toxic relationship with the present moment. Instead of living in the now with presence, we're always negotiating with the future, trying to avoid uncertainty, building walls against unpredictability. But reality doesn't negotiate with control. It shows up as it is, not as we wish it would be. And how we respond to that is what defines our emotional health. The contradiction reveals itself exactly where we most believe we're in control. The moment we're trying the hardest to manage every part of a situation, we're actually gripped by an invisible tension. It's hard to recognize at first, but it's there. Every expectation we create, every attempt to align everything to our ideal vision carries a risk, the risk of being ruled by the consequences of a control that was never real. This is where the paradox of control takes root. What looks like strength, planning, predicting, defining, quietly becomes a trap. The more we engage in trying to control the outside world, the more sensitive we become to the moments when it doesn't work. Small changes bring big reactions, and almost without realizing it, we start measuring our peace by how much of the world behaves according to our plan. That's the cycle. We create an expectation, resist anything that threatens it, and when reality shows up differently, we suffer. The suffering doesn't come from the situation itself, but from the distance between what we hoped for and what actually happened. The control we try to place on the outside ends up controlling how we feel on the inside. And with that, our emotional balance becomes hostage to things we can't truly manage. Have you noticed how just expecting something to go a certain way can already shift your emotional state? Expectation works like an emotional anchor. When we tie ourselves to a specific result, we lose flexibility in how we respond to life. We start reacting instead of responding. We resist the natural flow of events because, deep down, we believe our vision of how things should be is more important than what's actually unfolding. That resistance, even when subtle, wears us down. The more energy we spend trying to avoid the discomfort of not knowing, the stronger that discomfort becomes. And in doing so, we lose what we were searching for all along: peace. The control we believed would give us stability ends up being the very reason we feel unstable. And when we try to shape reality, we make ourselves more vulnerable to the constant frustration of failing to do so. There's a big difference between acting with intention and living attached to a result. When we're attached to an outcome, our actions are no longer free. They become anxious, forced, tense. There's no space left for learning or adapting, only effort, pressure, and exhaustion. And even if things go as planned, the relief doesn't last long, because soon another situation appears, demanding more control, more predictions, more guarantees. The true impact of the control paradox isn't just the anxiety it creates in the present. It's the way it limits our inner growth. When everything revolves around what we're trying to avoid or make happen, we stop developing the one ability that matters most in life: the ability to be present, to see what's really happening, and to respond consciously instead of reacting blindly. It's in this moment that many people suddenly realize what they've been calling control was really just a hidden form of fear: fear of losing, fear of being wrong, fear of being caught off guard, fear of feeling powerless. And when this fear goes unexamined, it quietly starts shaping how we experience life. When we refuse to accept the unpredictable as a natural part of life, we create a kind of suffering that doesn't come from outside. It's born within us. It's a silent kind of pain, building slowly over time, often without a clear name. The frustration of seeing things slip out of our hands, the discomfort of realizing nothing is happening the way we thought it would, the constant stress of trying to fix reality. It all adds up until the weight becomes obvious. Have you ever felt completely drained, not physically, but mentally, from trying to keep everything in the right place, at the right time, with the right people? And still, something goes wrong. Something slips through the cracks. Something doesn't turn out the way you planned, even after all your effort. That experience is more common than you might think, and it reveals something important. The more we resist what's out of our hands, the more we suffer over what we can't change. The human mind naturally seeks stability. It craves predictability as a form of protection. But when that search turns into rigidity, it starts working against us. Resisting reality as it is puts us in a constant inner battle. We try to force the present to match our mental projections. And when it doesn't, which is inevitable, the body tenses, thoughts become reactive, and emotions grow unstable. This kind of emotional resistance is one of the main causes of mental exhaustion. It's not just about having too many tasks or being overloaded with outside stimulation. It's the internal strain of constantly trying to stop life from being what it is. This non-stop fight against the unexpected puts us in a cycle of emotional alertness that drains our energy. The mind stays on high alert, the body stays defensive, and the heart stays in suspense. Bit by bit, even the simple act of living starts to feel like a heavy task. There's also a common confusion between responsibility and obsession. Being responsible means acting with awareness, owning what's ours, and responding with balance to whatever life brings. But often, what we call responsibility is actually a compulsive attempt to avoid anything going off track. We want to predict everything, control everything, make sure nothing strays from the plan. And when things inevitably don't go our way, we blame ourselves, as if we failed. But this kind of behavior doesn't make us stronger. It wears us down, because it traps us in a state of non-stop pressure, where we're never enough, never done, always needing to fix, improve, or anticipate something else. The obsession with control takes away our ability to breathe with ease. We turn every situation into an inner battlefield, always trying to adjust reality to fit standards that often aren't even ours. They were passed down, absorbed, copied. This emotional conflict between what we want to control and what we actually need to accept is one of the deepest sources of suffering. And it gets worse when we forget that resisting the unpredictable means denying the very nature of life. Life never promised to follow our rules, but it always gives us a chance to adapt if we're willing to listen to what it's really saying. Most people confuse acceptance with weakness, as if accepting meant giving up, as if not resisting meant abandoning our values, goals, or ability to act. But accepting isn't surrendering to laziness. It's not turning a blind eye to what bothers us. Acceptance means stopping the fight with what has already happened and choosing to respond from a place of clarity. When we're attached, we don't just want things to go a certain way. We tie our peace to the outcome. That makes us vulnerable. Because instead of having emotional independence, we start depending on a perfect outside scenario that may never come. Letting go doesn't mean you don't care. It actually means you care enough not to let your peace depend on something you can't control. It means being fully engaged in the present, but without demanding that it fit your expectations. It's an act of wisdom, not indifference. That wisdom often appears when we understand the cost of resisting. When we see that the more we try to control, the more unstable we feel. Letting go is a quiet acknowledgement that life moves on its own, with or without our permission. And instead of fighting that flow, we can learn to move with it. Have you ever felt relief by simply accepting that something didn't turn out the way you hoped? Have you ever felt the weight lift when you stopped trying to fix something that was never in your hands to begin with? That's not giving up. That's emotional intelligence. That's the ability to see things as they are, not just as we wish they were. And from there, we act with clarity. Conscious acceptance is a form of presence. It doesn't ignore problems, but it doesn't turn them into monsters either. It doesn't demand guarantees or full control. It watches, it understands, it adjusts. It knows life is always changing. And trying to freeze a single moment forever is a waste of energy. Letting go brings us back to reality, but not in a cold way. On the contrary, when we stop trying to control everything, we start feeling more deeply. Our sensitivity grows, and with that comes the clarity to see what is truly ours and what never was. That clarity is where real emotional freedom begins. But this process doesn't happen automatically. It takes an inner decision to stop resisting life as it is and start listening to it more honestly. And in that shift, something changes. Not the external circumstances, but the way we relate to them. Life is, by nature, unstable. Circumstances change, people change, situations change. And as long as we try to plant our roots in something unstable, we'll live in constant tension. True stability doesn't come from controlling others or controlling events. It comes from how deeply we know ourselves and the calm with which we live in that inner space. There is a kind of control that doesn't oppress, doesn't cause suffering, and doesn't rely on manipulation. It's the kind that comes from awareness, not about controlling what we feel, but understanding it. Not about suppressing what moves through us, but welcoming it with presence. This kind of mastery is quiet, but powerful, because it lets us act with discernment, even when everything around us feels uncertain. Have you noticed how the same situation can affect two people in completely different ways? One falls apart and the other stays centered. The difference isn't in what happened. It's in what was built inside. Because it's within ourselves that we build the emotional foundation that holds our choices. And when that foundation is solid, we don't need the world to cooperate with our plans in order to be at peace. That kind of strength doesn't show up overnight. It requires a change in direction. Instead of looking for answers outside, we start watching what's happening inside, our thoughts, our reactions, our impulses. And not to judge them, but to understand how we disconnect from ourselves every time we hand over the responsibility for our emotions to things beyond our control. Building that inner space is actually the greatest act of autonomy we can achieve. Because when we become emotionally independent from circumstances, we gain a freedom that doesn't rely on approval, results, or control. And with that freedom come more conscious choices, calmer, clearer, and more aligned with what truly matters. That doesn't mean being passive in life. On the contrary, it means acting with awareness, knowing when to step in and when to step back, when to persist and when to let go, when to hold a boundary and when to be flexible. That kind of wisdom comes from inner listening, from being present with our emotions without letting them take over. And when that inner strength starts to grow, the need to control the outside world starts to fade. Not because we stop caring about life, but because we stop demanding that it fit into our expectations. We begin to work with life, not against it. And that shift, though quiet, changes everything about how we move through the world. There's a kind of freedom that doesn't need to be chased outside, but simply remembered inside. It doesn't depend on the perfect situation or someone else's approval or the absence of obstacles. It's the freedom of not needing everything to be under control in order to feel peace. It's the relief that comes when we realize life never promised to obey our will, and yet it can still be deeply meaningful. Letting go isn't losing. It's releasing the burden of trying to hold what was never really ours to hold. It's stopping the mental battle with things that already happened, with people who didn't change, with scenarios that didn't follow our plans. Letting go is a sign of inner maturity. It's when we understand that trying to control everything drains us, and that there is more strength in conscious surrender than in constant resistance. When we stop demanding guarantees from life, it begins to flow more lightly. Not because the circumstances change, but because our relationship with them changes. We stop reacting to everything like we're victims of the unpredictable and start responding as someone who knows where their true center of balance is. And that center was never out there. It was always within. Have you ever asked yourself what you're trying to control right now? And if, just for a moment, you let it go, what would be left? Silence? Fear? Relief? Maybe it's in that space, in that moment of clear surrender, that a new kind of presence is born. Lighter, clearer, more connected to what truly matters. Letting go doesn't mean leaving everything to chance. It means ending the war with reality It means realizing that we can live with intensity, with responsibility, with depth, without needing to shape the world to fit our control. And when we do that, we don't lose power. We gain space, space to feel, to choose with awareness, to live with more truth. Because in the end, it's not control that protects us. It's our ability to adapt, to accept with wisdom, to respond with presence. That's real freedom, not the one that tries to control everything, but the one that knows how to move forward, even without knowing what comes next. Thank you for embarking on this journey with me. If this video resonated with you, I invite you to like and subscribe to our channel. Share this video with others so they can benefit from this message. And don't forget to leave a comment below sharing your thoughts, reflections, and experiences. Thanks again for watching and for joining me. Take care and see you soon.